Welcome to Careers in Discovery, where you'll meet scientists who've forged outstanding careers in biotech and hear about what they've learned along the way. This podcast is brought to you by Singular, building brilliant biotechs. Jenny Barnett is the CEO of Monument Therapeutics, a biotech company using precision medicine approaches to develop new treatments for psychiatric and neurological conditions, and the Chief Scientific Officer of 5 Lives, a digital therapeutics business focused on reducing dementia risk. Jenny joined us on Careers in Discovery to discuss her career so far, why academia wasn't for her, how digital biomarkers can improve clinical trial performance, and the things she had to learn to become an effective CEO. This week on Careers in Discovery, I'm absolutely delighted to be with Jenny Barnett of Monument Therapeutics. Jenny, welcome to the show.
Very much.
Good to see you. So Jenny, I always start by talking a little bit about the work you're doing now and the projects you're involved in and give people a bit of an introduction. So to start with, can you tell us a bit about Monument and a bit about your work and what's going on there currently?
Absolutely. So Monument Therapeutics is a new development company. We're neuroscience specialists, and we set it up 2 years ago, sort of plans during the COVID era, and then raised the funds to set it up independently 2 years ago. Of our work is to try and overcome a problem that's been a real issue for neuroscience, so psychiatry and neurology in general, which is that drugs that look good in the early stages of clinical trials often then fail to make it through and become available to patients. And we believe that a lot of that is to do with the way that we define patient populations. At the moment, we're trying to do something better than the standard, and we hope that that will help our own drugs get to market and also demonstrate to people that we learn lessons from areas like oncology, where a personalized approach to medicine has really helped with drug development. We think that there's to learn these lessons and make neuroscience the new oncology.
Yes, I see. And this sort of idea of precision medicine is it's a term that gets used to cover a lot of different activities or different approaches, right? You're particularly using it from a point of view of patient selection and working that back to how you then discover and develop the drugs. Is that correct?
Exactly. So if you think about kind of cutting edge in psychiatry at the moment, if you go to your GP and say that you're having problems with mood and you're feeling really sad, there's not a lot of active testing goes on there. They're reliant on how you describe your symptoms. And what we think is that in reality, depression and most psychiatric disorders aren't one single disease. So you and I might both have low mood, but we might have it for totally different biological reasons. So even in areas where there are lots of drugs going on, there's many treatments for depression, for example, the same drug wouldn't work on both you and I because we have different brains and different causes of agitation. So what we're trying to do with Monument is use ways of actually measuring brain function, non-invasive. So we're not using people in scanners or anything like that. We're essentially having people complete a series of computer games, but that have been developed over a long period of time. So then each of those games is measuring a very specific brain process in the brain. From that, we can find groups of patients who have similar looking brains, similar abnormalities in brain processes. And we're using that approach to, as you say, select homogeneous groups of patients and then apply drugs that we think should act on that brain process. So each of our programs has a digital biomarker that defines the patient group, and then a drug that we hope is going to effectively treat that group throughout the clinical trials, and eventually the biomarker will be there for your doctor to assess in clinic. Does it look like you're going to respond well to this drug? Let's do a test and find that out.
Yeah, interesting. And I suppose, the immediate reaction might be, I suppose, why would you narrow your patient population further? But then when you calculate that against 90+% failure rate and these sorts of things. I suppose there's a balancing out there to narrow it down enough that you get a better chance of success, but not so far that it's success for one person.
That's exactly right. I've worked with great scientists in many pharmaceutical companies, and they all everybody understands that we need better approaches to neuroscience. But as you say, there's a real commercial drive for what must be good if we could develop a drug that worked for everybody. Surely that will, or that we could at least prescribe to everybody. Surely that would be better. So that's always been the commercial push for more precision medicine approaches. But I always go back to cancer and say cancer drugs only started working once we realised that we had to actually measure what was going on in the tumour and match that appropriately. And then more successful oncology has been ever since. And I think we're just on the cusp of that now, of winning that argument in neuroscience. People do believe it, and as you say, the very high rates of neuroscience drug failure that have happened historically give a little bit of impetus to actually try and do something a bit different now.
And is there a particular approach that you're taking to it in terms of, obviously there's been big advances in bioinformatic analysis of different types of omics data, which have helped with precision medicine and, lots of different things around sequencing that have moved the field forward. Are there particular technologies or approaches you're employing that you can talk about?
No, it's a really good question. So there are a few science companies out there, and we all have different approaches, slightly different technologies. So there are companies that use multi-omic approaches, as you're describing. There are companies that use things like brain scanning, brain imaging, EEG, which is that bath pack that you wear, and there's in your brain. So there's lots of ways of measuring brain function, and we're all really trying to measure the same basic biology. The approach that we use with these things that look like computer games really has two advantages. The first is that these have been around for quite a long time. So Cambridge Monument spun out of has been using these technology for about 20 years as the endpoints in clinical trials. So to look at what a drug has in the brain. So they're really well validated. There's about 3,000 publications that have used them, as well as lots of clinical trials for new drugs and new drug mechanisms. So we really know everything about, from this menu of biomarkers, we know an awful lot about their different sensitivities in patient groups and also in drugs. It's what allows us to match the biomarker with the drug for our new programs. The other thing that's really useful about them is that they're super scalable. So they take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to run. You can run on a mobile phone, on a computer, anything that's attached to the internet. And that means that from the point of view of running multinational trials, and ultimately from the point of view of using these things in real medicine, real world practice, it's going to be a lot easier to scale up than something that involves, specialist equipment like a brain scanner or something like that. So I think there's lots of ways that one could try and set these brain functions. We just like the way that our technology is kind of quick and easy and makes it possible to do this at scale.
Yes, I see. It's interesting. I suppose the rise of smartphones has really made that scalability greater, right? Because I remember years and years ago, I can't even remember who I was going to see, but I remember going to see a client, and I don't know if Cambridge Cognition, maybe we were in the same building or something, but there was a computer terminal where Cambridge Cognition tests were set up, but it was a desktop hardwired computer system. I guess those restrictions, of course, have all gone now, and it's much easier for people to get involved in this.
The original Cantab technology, so computer games running on a touch screen, essentially, they were originally developed in the Department of Pharmacology in the University of Cambridge, and the reason they were on a touch screen, and I'm talking about the 1980s, so touchscreen computers were like really well new, but they were on a touch screen, as opposed to ways that we often measure brain function in humans that involves words and moving a pencil across paper and this kind of thing. So the touchscreen allowed you to do the exact same test, not only in your healthy volunteers and in your patients, but also earlier in drug development in rodents and in monkeys. Okay. So there are still scientific labs out there that are running the same tests that we're using in patients
Yeah.
to help, develop drugs being used in early stage with rats in boxes with a touchscreen computer at the front, tapping away, doing the exact same assay. So as the premise was, as we move through stage drug development, lots of things about the brain that changes that make it difficult to use animal data to predict how a human will respond. But if we can at least be measuring exactly the same thing in exactly the same way as we move across species, then that's kind of one less problem to deal with. But yeah, in the 1980s, touchscreens were rare, and now, of course, we all probably have one on our pocket, and some of us have one on our wrist, and it's really made data a whole lot easier.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And so you spend most of your time with Monument and focusing on the therapeutic side of things. But you're also involved in an organization called Five Lives. Can you tell us a little bit about that? A little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Five Lives is really to set population level brain health, not through drugs as we're doing at Monument, but by looking at how lifestyle can be used to protect, particularly against dementia. So it's not really well known by most people, but dementia, things like Alzheimer's disease, out as you can prevent it to about the same extent that you can prevent something like a heart attack. So somewhere around 40% of dementia is thought to be driven by lifestyle factors that are potentially modifiable. And actually, they're the same lifestyle factors that we should be doing because of cardiac risk and cancer risk and all those kinds of things. So it's, make sure you're getting plenty of physical activity, it's a good diet, don't smoke, don't drink too much, all these kinds of things. But there are a few that are relatively specific to the brain. So social activity is really important. Things like anything that reduces your social activity. So if you start to have hearing loss in your old age, it's really important to get a hearing aid, get that remediated. And that's thought to be because if you stimulating your brain because you're getting less conversational action, that's bad for your brain. We know that there's also a bit of actively active in your old age, whether that's whatever your favorite form of puzzle is, or learning a new language, playing music, all these kinds of things. So all of that together wraps up to being about 40% of dementia risk. And the thing that's important is that actually we now understand that pathologies in the brain of things like Alzheimer's disease don't come on very suddenly. They develop very slowly over decades of life. So if you want to protect your brain from them, you need to start doing those lifestyle changes as early as possible.
Yes.
So it's never too late, and it isn't, but it's also never too early to start protecting your brain. So what we're doing at Five Lives is we're actually helping people to understand their individual risk for dementia. So they take an assessment that looks at their medical history, who they are demographically, and asks them about their lifestyle. Then tells them not only their risk of developing dementia over the next 10 years, but what in their life that can be done. And then there are educational and coaching pieces that get people to make those changes if they want to be more active, eat more healthily, and those kinds of things.
Yes.
The thing I like about it as a company is that the guys that set it up, the co-founders, Sylvain and Zav, they've come from consumer gaming. So they really understand how to get people to spend time on their phone, interacting in this, lovely experience that's really interesting, gets people coming back day after day. And they've decided to do that for good, and to do that to try and get people to change behaviors that are going to support their brain health, rather than just supporting the economics of the gaming industry. So I really like that about them. There's a lot of digital therapeutics out there that are very well designed from a scientific point of view. It's not that much fun to take part in that. So you don't necessarily, if people don't keep coming back, they're not getting a dose of that therapeutic action, they're not going to make those long-term changes. These guys really come at it from the other point of view, which is, first of all, we've got to engage with people, and then we've got to feed them little nuggets of health ingredient that help them to change those habits in a long-term way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that really on the rise with sort of fitness apps and things like Duolingo for language learning and things. They've done a really good job with those sorts of things, some of them, haven't they? And it has not just made the app successful, but, you know, hopefully improved people's lives and learning and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology in the new world of
Yes.
for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that something that's available for people currently?
Yep. So the Five Lives app is live in the UK. It's a approved medical device, so it can only be sold in countries where it's got approval. The UK is kind of the first target market. Yeah, it's available on the App Store and really useful for anyone that's worried about their risk of future dementia. So it's designed for people who might be with dementia right now. It's really designed for people sort of 50 to 70, maybe who've had the experience of caring from dementia, or who are beginning to notice changes in their own memory function or cognitive function,
Yes.
and what understand what that means and understand what they can do to support their brain to
Yeah.
remain as healthy as possible for as long as possible.
Fab. Well, I will look into that myself after this. And so, Jenny, this theme, I suppose, of neurological conditions, psychiatric conditions, the sort of diseases of the brain, I suppose, has been really the central theme of your career from what I can see. So, I guess to start with, tell us a little bit about why science, why this area of science, why this career for you?
Yeah, I never. It's funny looking back. I don't know if you experienced this with many of your guests, but it's all a bit of an accident. Would be the
Yes.
honest answer. So I took psychology at sixth form because I had to take, I think, either psychology, history, or geography, and didn't want to do history or geography again.
Mm,
Really enjoyed it. Had a great teacher who said you should think about going on to do a degree in this area. So I did experimental psychology at Oxford, went straight into a PhD after that in the Department of Psychiatry in Cambridge.
hmm.
Um, had a wonderful PhD supervisor who made it all go swimmingly, which of course is not necessarily the norm in academia,
Sure.
but really important. And just from there, I think my choices have just been whatever seemed like a good idea at the time. I postdoced for a little bit in the States,
Hmm.
which did turn me off academia slightly, but also exposed me to industry, which is not something that psychology graduates necessarily see
True.
a lot
Yeah.
of. Um, and then moved into industry when I moved back to the UK. So it's really all happened by chance.
Hmm.
I spun Monument out because it was a research project that rather got out of hand in Cambridge Cognition and needed a life of its own, and we needed a CEO, so that ended up being me.
Yeah, I see. I see. So as you said, you went out to the US and you were at the Broad Institute, if I'm correct.
The Broad Institute, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Tell us a bit about that, because that must be a great place to go and conduct research and learn about what's really going
It was
on.
fantastic, yes. So I was interested in learning about the genetic basis of psychiatric disorders, and Broad, which at the time was jointly funded by MIT and Harvard, was kind of a new up and coming place that was has just turned into a real genetic powerhouse.
Hmm.
Um, it was just when the first US studies were happening. So for the first time, we were beginning to get something more than single gene hypothesis driven genetic studies in psychiatry.
Yeah.
And we'd seen in other areas, other types of disease, that these US studies were hugely powerful and just opened up new pathways that nobody had understood before were related to that disease. So I wanted to get a little bit of that action, and ended up in a psychiatric genetics group on a sort of visiting fellowship for a year. It was
Hmm.
an amazing year. I learned all kinds of stuff, but it was a real eye opener, having been in this very functional group in the UK, protected by a wonderful PhD supervisor. And I was in Cambridge. Cambridge is quite a competitive place. You meet
Sure. Yeah.
plenty of ambitious people, But yeah, the kind of Harvard MIT was a whole nother world to me in
Mhm.
terms of amazing people, you know, brilliant place to do science, but also exposed me for the first time for kind of lab politics and people arguing about whose name goes where on the paper and that
Right.
kind of thing that just wasn't my idea of fun, or it wasn't my idea of what science should be about, really. I met a really interesting guy who I'd known as being an NIH professor, and he had just switched to the pharmaceutical industry. And I said to him in my rather naive way, I'm very surprised at you moving to industry. And he said, well, I've just concluded that if you actually want to make a difference to patients' lives, you need to develop drugs. And that means
Mhm.
you need to be in the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, he's absolutely right. And that was really what caused me to switch to industrial science, you know.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, and so you went on to join Cambridge Cognition following that. So I guess tell us a little bit about what you were doing there and where the company was at, and obviously you were there for some time and progressed your career there. Tell us a bit about that part of your journey.
Yes, I joined immediately after 1 year's postdoc in the States. So I was still pretty very inexperienced from a commercial point of view.
Hmm.
I knew a lot about a specific area, as one tends to when you've been
Yes.
doing PhDs and postdocs, but really nothing about my PhD was in schizophrenia. I really knew nothing about areas outside of that.
Hmm.
Um, Cambridge Cognition at that point was predominantly the scientists in Cambridge Cognition were predominantly running a sort of consulting role, so helping pharmaceutical clients understand how to use Cambridge Cognition's technology, helping them design clinical trials in the best way to make
Right.
use of that and to help them, you know, learn the most they could about their drug. So it was a real baptism of fire. I didn't know a great deal of pharmacology. I didn't know
Hmm.
anything about working with pharma companies, and I learned loads.
Yes.
Lots of experience. It's a bit of a unique role because you get to work across many different pharmaceutical companies on many different drugs and different indications simultaneously. So
I
really
see.
interesting for people like me that have difficulty concentrating on one thing for a long time. Um, so I worked my way up through becoming increasingly senior in that at Cambridge Cognition, and we also at that time were trying to build up more of a research and development function within the company.
Yes.
So rather than using the existing technology to um, uh, ha help pharmaceutical companies, we're also interested in how we could use new technologies to better measure brain function. Um, so, for example, as we were describing earlier, actually, as the advent of smartphones, which has given us a touchscreen in each of our pockets, it's also given us a way of recording voice, for example, very
Right.
easily. So we did some projects looking at things like how interactions with voice assistants can collect pieces of data that, if you process it correctly, can tell you something about the person's mental state.
Okay.
Um, and we know this from the fact that if you pick up the phone to someone that you know well, you know straight away if they're sleepy or
Hmm.
upset or, you know, having a bad day. You can hear that in the voice. So the voice is it's a very complex form of data, but it tells you a lot about person's health and
Yes.
sedation and mood and all these kinds of things. So it's also R&D team to try and build up these new ways of measuring cognitive function or brain function, brain health. And those two teams, the sort of pharma consulting one and the R&D team, have continued to go great guns at Cambridge Cognition. As I said, Monument was one of those R&D projects that grew out of hand,
Hmm.
and by that point, I'd been chief scientist there for about 5 years, and was kind of coming to the end of my tenure there in terms of uh, the time that I'd been there.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, my COVID project, ably assisted by Mark Traherne, who ended up being the chair of Monument,
Hmm.
was to try and raise the funding to make Monument an independent company,
Yeah, I
and
see.
we did that in 2021.
Yes. So a nice easy time to go and raise money and, and set up a
But it was interesting
company.
because I think it was the first time that fundraising wasn't about sort of shaking hands and giving
True.
PowerPoint presentations in the room. So it was an interesting time to raise money in terms of uh, the changing world of that time.
Yes.
Things we'd
And
never go back to.
so, as you said, the project started as a research project within Cambridge Cognition. What were the sort of origins of it, and how did it develop to the point where you thought, actually, this has got some legs, and we should do this separately?
Yeah, great question. One of the frustrations of working across so many different drug development programs had been seeing similarities in drug signal. So many pharma companies often have compounds with similar mechanisms of action that they're testing in similar populations, at roughly the same time in history. So you'd often see something, a drug having a particular effect on the brain in one study, and then you'd sort of have the chance to replicate that, because working with a different company, you'd see the same effect
Yes.
with a similar drug in a similar patient population. So that kind of convinces you that these are real effects. And what we would often see were drugs that looked really good in the early stages, sort of their effect being washed out or diluted in phase 2 and phase 3 trials, which are of course the most expensive and painful to run from a resource point of view. Sometimes pharma companies would be interested in understanding what went wrong in those late stage trials, and whether they could have predicted from the early stage data that the drug wouldn't meet the criteria. And so my colleague Kiri Granger in particular, who's now the CSO at Monument, did a number of projects looking back in data sets from failed trials and looking at patterns in those data and whether it could have been predicted earlier. So we'd always known, in theory, that there are these different types of patients, as we were describing earlier. But when you see that in data, then it starts to become a bit clearer, and you think, well, what is it that could have told us about these different types of patients early on? Of course, having these digital biomarkers at hand and in these data sets, that was an obvious place to look. And so we started with in the what has turned into our schizophrenia program, looking at whether a particular measure of brain function would be useful in segregating out patients that then might be treatable with a particular type of drug. And it sort of grew from there, and is now one of our two lead therapeutic programs.
Yes, I see. And over the last few years, and maybe this is some recency bias on my part, I'm not sure, but it seems like the sort of the amount of attention being diverted to some of these neurological disorders and neurodegenerative disorders particularly is increasing. And I think, for a long time, they'd been somewhat not shied away from, but somewhat perhaps deprioritized largely because of the complexity and probably because of the failure rate that had been seen previously. What have you seen? Because you saw a lot of drug development programs and across this disease area. Have you seen particular reasons why that trend's occurred, or are there particular things happening that you think are enabling neurodegenerative research or neurological research, drug research to get further than it has done before?
Yeah, I think we see it in a number of areas, but Alzheimer's is probably the most obvious.
Right.
So company investment in neuroscience has gone through ups and downs. Even in my career, and when you talk to people that have been working in the field for 30 or 40 years, they absolutely say that. For the first time, I think now, with some successes in terms of new Alzheimer's drugs coming out, that has really helped on the commercial side, and it's also helped to push this message that I was sort of giving earlier in terms of biomarker-led drug development or stratified medicine drug development. So the amount of money that's gone into Alzheimer's research and failed Alzheimer's trials over the last 20 years is absolutely horrific. And only really this year have we seen the first effective disease-modifying treatments, so treatments that actually slow down the disease, come to market.
Yes.
After 20 years of very big, expensive late-stage failures. And a lot of that, some of that is just, the brain is complicated. It takes a long time to understand any particular disease. But I think we've also learned some lessons now, and one is that we should be measuring something if we're trying to treat it. So even 10 years ago, the same type of drugs, so drugs that or antibodies, I should say, that try and reduce the amount of the amyloid protein, these Alzheimer's plaques in the brain. There were some of those in trials quite a long time ago, but actually, when we look back now, because we didn't measure whether individual people had amyloid in the brain, we found that, a lot of the people that were in those trials for drugs to take amyloid out of the brain didn't have any in the brain in the
I
first
see.
place.
Okay.
That was because we didn't know how to measure it. We were using clinical criteria that says if you're a person over a certain age with a certain number of symptoms and you seem to have a problem with your memory, well, it's probably Alzheimer's disease. What we do now, and where it really changed for those successful drugs, is we actually measure whether there's amyloid. We can measure it in your spinal fluid, or we can put you in a brain scanner and measure whether there's amyloid in your brain. And only if there's amyloid in the brain is it likely that removing it is going to have a good effect on your on your symptoms. So that kind of approach has now won the day. It's clear that we will better develop drugs. We'll have a better chance of developing drugs if we know what we're measuring and if the drug is targeting that thing at an individual patient level. These are areas of huge unmet medical need, right? The number of people that might be suitable for that Alzheimer's drug, the number of people whose lives could be helped by better drugs in psychiatry are absolutely enormous. So they've always been commercially attractive areas to pharmaceutical companies. It's just been really difficult. And if we're now starting to have the tools and methodologies that mean that it's more likely to be successful, I think we'll continue to see a lot of investment in this area.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And thinking about from a career point of view, Jenny, and your journey through your career, a few things that I was interested to dig more into. So you moved recently then from a position as chief scientific officer of a pretty large mature company, and working in partnership with other companies, to being the chief executive of a much smaller biotech company. How's that transition going? How has it been? What have been the differences? Tell me a bit about what you've seen over the last year or so in doing that.
Well, I love it, is the short answer. In part because I was so fortunate as to take my team with me, essentially, when we spun out. So there haven't been a lot of the kind of growing pains of finding the right people and getting the right people in these positions. My co-founders were colleagues at Cambridge Cognition and had been working on the same project for a long time. So that's definitely smoothed the path enormously. It also, because it happened sort of throughout the COVID era, that has made the switch from going into an office and having colleagues around to working remotely from our homes. We're essentially a virtual company. We're all home based, so that's made that switch. Well, it certainly normalised it because everyone was doing it at the same time. So in general, I've absolutely loved that experience. The bits that are tough are the bits of being a founder and responsible for the financial well-being of the company that I didn't have before. So, fundraising is absolutely the core job of the CEO in small companies like this, and it's a tough time to be fundraising. Of course, everyone I know that is doing so says the same thing. So that's been the biggest learning curve. Fundraising and board interactions. I've never been on a board before. I didn't know what boards do really, and now I'm responsible to one and run one once a month. So those have been big learning curves. But the team and the day job and the culture has been an absolute joy. So and the science has been going really well, which is not always the case. So
No,
feel very lucky in respect.
No, absolutely. And I suppose thinking about your career as a whole, you've obviously made several transitions through your career, from being in academia to moving into industry, from being a researcher to taking on leadership responsibilities to an executive role, and as we just talked about, into the CEO position. I appreciate I'm asking you to distill a long period of time into a few sentences. But, if there were things from a career point of view that you feel you've particularly learned or that have been particularly important in your development, what are the things that you would point to there that you might pass on as advice?
I think the biggest thing I try and say to sort of young scientists or junior scientists, particularly people, I often come across people who are finishing up their PhD and not sure where to go next. And I think because PhDs happen in an academic environment, and so your role models in that environment are academics, they're people
Mm-hmm.
who have succeeded at becoming a career academic. And so I think it's incredibly difficult to conceive that just because you could do that, because you might be good enough to do that, does not mean that that is what you should do and what would make you happiest and how you want to spend your life. So
Right.
I hope it's changed now because I think it is more permeable. The wars between academia and industry get ever more permeable.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly when I left from a postdoc and went into industry, I felt a lot of scorn from people in academia along the lines of, but you're really quite good. Why would you want
Right.
to do that? And the reality is there are fantastic scientists in industry as well. You don't know about them because the job of an industry scientist is not to promote their own career, build their own career, get their names on papers, have a lab, the so and so lab.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how it works in industry. It's absolutely a team sport, and a successful career in industry means that something has happened in the world that wasn't there before. A
Right.
drug
Yes.
was approved or something like that. So that you completely different culture and working environment, but that still needs brilliant scientists to come into it. So I think that's the biggest challenge for people who have grown up in academia is understanding whether that very different way of doing science is likely to suit them or not. And I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how people ever find out other than by jumping, or maybe people that have been so lucky as to work in a how to do a sandwich course or get
Yes.
some kind of work experience outside of academia. But yeah, I think that's the one thing I would say is there are lots of ways to use a science degree or a PhD usefully in the world. So if you don't enjoy the particular way that it's used in
Mm-hmm.
academic life, there are all kinds of other useful things you can do with it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think as you mentioned earlier, sometimes it's difficult to tell before trying it, but also the the door the door the other way is not quite as closed as it perhaps was in previous years. I think you're right. People, it's not still the norm, but people do go back and forth a little bit more, and there
Yeah.
seems to be the two sides do seem to be coming closer together in some places. So I guess that finality of the decision to move into industry is perhaps a little less severe than it was. So you can go
Yeah,
and
I
try
think so.
that.
I think there's also a lot more opportunity to collaborate with
Mm-hmm.
industry. So, you know, many academics, most academics will at some point in their career have the opportunity to get a taste of industry through
Yes.
collaboration. You may or may not like it, but I think it gives both makes that membrane less permeable, and if you do ever want to go back, and also gives young scientists the opportunity to try and get some exposure to industry science and see whether that might be something that they like to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to Monument, tell us a little bit about what's next. What's happening over the next 6, 12 months?
That's an interesting question. We're in a fundraising period, so essentially we spun out with seed funding and
Hmm.
have now hit all the milestones that paid for. So the two lead programs are ready to go into clinical trials and awaiting fundraising on that. So my job at the moment is to catalyse that fundraising into happening, which I'm very hopeful will happen in the next 6 months.
Yes,
We have had some news that we're going to be included in a very large grant-funded study that should
fantastic.
start next year. which will really accelerate one of our drug development programs. It's a schizophrenia drug development program.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. That gives us a really big endorsement of our science, and also a way of making our drug development plans happen more quickly than they would otherwise.
Yes.
But that's brand new news. So a lot of my time at the moment is figuring out how we can ensure that happens as quickly as possible, and use that to help catalyze the fundraising process.
Yeah.
So it's all good things, but there's a few shifting parts at the moment, which I'm sure is the norm for a CEO, right?
Yeah.
That's the job these days.
That's it. If you're being successful in doing what you're doing, then there's going to be the next step to take, right? And that's always exciting. But it sounds like really positive progress. And
yeah, absolutely, it's going very well at the moment.
yeah. Well, Jenny, it's a fascinating project that you have there. It's something that seems to be making real progress, and as you said, will have a real impact. And we wish you the best of luck with the raise and beyond. And we will be keeping an eye on it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. It's been really real pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks very much for listening. Careers in Discovery is sponsored by Singular, helping you to build a brilliant biotech company. Biotech leaders spend far too much time, money, and energy on hiring and people issues. Head to www.singular-biotech.com to learn how you can recruit and engage your team more effectively, so you can focus on developing medicines, treating patients, and saving lives.